Hi, this is Dan from SPE. Today we're going to be going over SPE's 6.7 Emperor Turbo Kit for the 6.7 Powerstroke 2011 to current 19. Basically what we're going to do is kind of go over what's in the kit as far as all the individual parts and show you guys what's on the packing list that will come in your box. Kind of make sure everything is there when you're opening your kit up. That's kind of the first thing you need to do. So we're going to go over all those components, kind of what they are as well, so that you understand it when you're putting it together. It'll make it much easier. And we're also going to give you a kind of dry run installation on a engine that is not in a truck. Give you a better overall visual rather than it being crammed in a truck, which honestly isn't necessary to show you how to put this kit on. So yeah, let's move into what we have in the kit and we'll start there. So we'll start over here at this side of the table. We'll start with your fittings. What you got is your, and you guys can kind of follow along on your packing list for the kit, and then you'll be able to kind of see as I go through all this where it's at on your list, and that'll help you a little. You will have one 1/8 inch NPT plug that will go in the pedestal. You'll have your oil feed fitting for the turbo, and you'll have the oil feed fitting, so the oil coming out of the pedestal. That'll be the fitting for that. On the 11 to 14 model, it will come with a it's basically a screw-in plug for the temperature sensor on the fuel rail. You're basically going to pull that out, and it's just going to stay off the truck. You're not going to use that temperature sensor. You'll have O-rings for the oil drain flange off of the turbo. That would be this one. You'll have two O-rings that go on the drain fitting that goes into the pedestal. So those two would go on this. You'll have all your gaskets basically that you need to install this. You're going to have your exhaust manifold gasket, the base pedestal gasket, and the T4 gasket. This will be in the box with the turbo. You're going to, moving on down here, you got two scroll clamps for the oil drain tube. And we'll also get into this more when we're installing it. This will need cut to length. It's nothing invasive. You're just going to take and cut off roughly 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch off of each end. And by doing that, you'll get it at the correct height for the turbo. We did it this way because we want this to fit as many applications as possible, because you can buy this kit without the turbo and put a larger frame on it, and it will raise the height of the turbo. So by doing that, you're going to obviously need a longer tube. But for the S300 frame, you will need to trim this back just a little bit. So there's the clamps for that. These will be for the lower intake manifold coupler, which would be this one. Those will go on that. These T-bolts will go on, you will receive one intercooler hose. For the intercooler pipe, it'll go on the actual intercooler side of the hot side pipe. Once again, we'll cover that whenever we get into installing it. You'll have actually two of these. You'll have two V-bands. You'll have the 15 clamp, and you will have the clamp for this adapter here to go onto the actual back of the S300 exhaust housing. So this will adapt from the S300 outlet to the 2015 style downpipe, and obviously you'll need two clamps to do the adapting. The kit will come with the clamp for the turbo side. If you're doing a 11 to 14 model, you will need to purchase the 15 style downpipe clamp. As far as the rest of the oiling stuff, you will have obviously an oil feed line. You will also have your oil drain flange out of the bottom of the turbo. And then this will basically connect like that This will go on here, this will go on here. That will be your whole kind of return drain system for the turbo. Covers that. There's your pedestal, obviously. And now as far as hardware goes, you're gonna have two shorter bolts that will be used in the oil return flange that goes in the bottom of the turbo. You're gonna have 8 manifold bolts, and you will be extracting the main studs that are the factory studs that mount the stock manifold. You'll actually be extracting those and using these grade 12.9 manifold bolts. They're just way more durable, and it's a lot better setup. These are your pedestal bolts. You'll have 4 washers for those. And the turbo mounting bolts, depending on what kit, if you got an earlier kit, they will come with this style bolt. It's actually a flange nut, and you will have to use the smaller washer with it, and that would obviously come in your kit. The later build kits, I should say, they will come with an Allen style mounting bolt for the turbo. So on the cooling side of the system, on the early build kit, we have a plug style block off that will just go in there, and you'll cut the hose, you'll put this in, and then put the clamp over it. On the later build kit, we have a silicone cap, just goes right on there. Uses actually the same clamp. So that pretty much covers your basic hardware and hard parts. The only other thing you're going to have is obviously the turbocharger. You're going to have your couplers. As I said, when we install, we'll show you where these couplers go. Real quick, we're going to go over some of the basic tools you're going to need. There's really nothing tool-wise that's really weird. The only thing that you may not have, and this does make life a little bit easier, but it's not a necessity, is it is actually, it's called an inverted Torx. It is a Torx that's inverted. It sticks up like a male-ended Torx. They call this socket an E7. We'll show you what you're going to use that for here in a second. Everything else is very cut and dry. You're going to need a 6mm Allen and 8mm Allen drive, 11 or 7/16, ½ inch, 9/16, and then basically your general wrenches. There's really nothing in this kit that requires any kind of crazy tools or anything. Honestly, as far as tools go, you're probably going to use more tools just to get the factory turbo off. So that pretty much covers that. Now let's move on to starting the installation of this turbo. So we have the factory turbo already removed from this engine. This is basically, assuming that you purchase this kit and you're doing the work yourself, or you were a shop and doing the work, we're assuming that if you purchase this kit that you're gonna obviously know how to get it down to this point by removing the factory components. So we're gonna start there to save a little bit of time in the video and just keep it more simple. Essentially, you're gonna need to get it down to this point. So the passenger side exhaust manifold is gonna need to be removed. You'll take that off. Obviously, the pedestal and everything will be out when you take the factory turbo out. And you're pretty much gonna be to this point. You will retain, on all models, you will retain the factory driver side manifold, and you will need a 15 and up style up pipe on the driver's side, and you will also need to retain the factory V-band clamp for the up pipe to the turbo, so that can stay on there. The one thing you are going to have to do after removing the passenger side manifold is you're going to need to remove the studs. And that E7 socket that we were just talking about, this is where it comes into play. So what you're going to do, I'll show you, this is a factory style stud, and this is that inverted Torx. If we can get it to focus here, and there we go. That is the inverted Torx, and that E7 socket fits right on the end of this. So it makes it super simple to get out because it's obviously just like a nut and bolt style deal, and it'll back right off. So If you do not have the E7 socket or don't even really want to mess with that, take one nut, thread it down, put another nut above it, back it off, and you'll lock them and then break it loose that way. These studs normally come out very easily. It's normally not a big deal. So what you'll do after removing those studs is we recommend, before actually even doing that, we recommend putting the pedestal in. Just because you can get this all cleaned up and get this covered, because it is a very open area in the valley. So you don't want excessive debris or anything like that falling down in the engine. So what I would recommend is clean off your block, get your pedestal ready, grab your gasket and your pedestal and install it. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you, as far as the pedestal goes, I'm going to show you what you have to do to prep it and get it ready, and then we'll get that installed. So for the pedestal, what you're going to actually need to do is you're going to get your two of your fittings that we talked about earlier. You're going to get your 1/8 inch NPT fitting and your 1/8 to -4 oil feed fitting. You're going to install those. I do recommend taping them or using some type of thread sealer on them. I'll kind of show you what that looks like with them installed. You'll just screw them in like that. Pretty tight. There is no, torque. The 1/8 inch NPT is a tapered thread, so there isn't truly a torque setting that you're going to have to achieve with that. Just get them snug. And then this is basically ready to go on at that point. So grab your gasket, your base gasket, grab your pedestal, and your 4 Allen bolts and washers. Let's put it on. So at this point, you're going to take your gasket. It'll pretty much only fit on one way. You'll put that down in the valley, as so. You're going to take your pedestal, once again making sure that this is all very clean, and the pedestal will also only go on one way. Sit it in there, it'll hit the guide pins, pretty much locks in. And then you're going to take your hardware, install your washer on the end of the Allen, and this is also an 8mm drive with a washer. Install those. Thread these in. Pretty simple. They are angled, so just take note of that. You'll probably notice that when you remove the turbo. Install those, run those down. After getting all your bolts threaded in by hand, you're going to want to go across them, cross pattern. You're going to want to torque them to around 35 foot-pounds. That's what we recommend. Holes then installed. The only thing you'll have open at this point is the oil drain hole, so just take note. You can put a rag in that for now, or just be careful. You don't want anything falling down in there. As I said before with the manifold, you are going to need to extract these studs, and there are different routes to do that. You can use the E7 Torx, inverted Torx, or you can double nut it and essentially put one nut on, another nut above it, back the nut off, and you'll use 2 wrenches and tighten them together. After you do that, you're going to grab a hold of the bottom nut and just with a wrench and just back it out. They come out pretty easy. It's normally not an issue. Now you're going to get ready to install the manifold. Basically, make sure your mating surface on the head is clean. You're going to want to make sure that there's nothing built up on the V-band as well. Take your gasket. It only fits one way. This gasket is included in the kit. You're going to line your holes up, get everything kind of close. Then you're going to grab your manifold. Once again, you do need a 15 and up style up pipe on the driver's side. So just take note of that. If you have a 15 and up truck, you will not need to replace it. If you have an 11 to 14, you will need the newer style up pipe. You can leave this up pipe, which we recommend leaving it slightly loose. If you want to just crack the bolts loose, or when you install it, make sure they're just somewhat loose. Run them down, don't tighten them. Leaving everything loose until you get all of the bolts in this assembly, it does make it a little bit easier. But you're basically just going to take your manifold, drop it down in here. You're going to line up this V-band. You'll see it drops in pretty easily. Make sure that the actual inside of this V-band has a step in it, an external step. And on the inside of the manifold, it does have a step to receive it. There's a receiver groove in there. You're going to want to make sure that those made up good and flush. So set it down in there, and then basically at this point you're going to put all your bolts in, and as you put these bolts in and get all this kind of set up, you just want to make sure that this stays nice and butted together. Also, to make one more note on installing the manifold, your bolts are a grade 12.9 Allen. They are a 6mm drive head, so you will be needing that. After getting all your bolts in hand tight, you're going to want to go over them with a torque wrench, and on the manifold bolts we recommend 25 foot-pounds. So you want to go over those. Same thing, you can do a cross section or cross pattern rather. Normally helps, but it's not necessary. So there's 25. Like I said, 25 foot-pounds is more than sufficient, and it's a little bit tighter than factory, and it works very well. So there we go. Now, after getting your bolts torqued, then you're going to want to make sure that this is butted up very nice and tight. And then once you get it nice and tight, you're going to want to come back here and tighten down your 13mm bolts, your factory bolts. Tighten them up, snug them up good. Once again, make sure that this is touching the whole way around on your V-band. And then literally all you have to do at that point is take your V-band, snap it back together here. Snap it back together, and then I normally orient it facing the truck or facing up like this, because if you would need to tighten it or get to it, it's much easier because it's forward of the cab. So basically at that point you're going to take your 11mm and tighten that up. Once again, it's one of those things, you're going to tighten it up, make it snug. So essentially run that down till it's nice and snug. You'll know it'll start to get pretty tight. Don't go crazy with it. Most of the seal is done where those interlock, so you don't need to get real crazy on the tension. So basically tighten that down. You can tighten that a little finished, and now you're going to move on to the turbo. Once you're done tightening the V-band, you're pretty much ready to go. The manifold's in, the up pipe is in, and you're ready to move on to essentially the turbo. So to prepare the turbo, the first thing you're going to want to obviously do is pull out all your plugs. There's a couple different ways you can go about installing the turbo. My personal favorite way to do it is to actually remove your exhaust housing bolts. So right in here, you can see where these plates are. They actually retain the center section of the turbo into the turbine housing. So what you'll do is you'll take a 13mm wrench, come in here. There's 4 of these. There's 2 holding slats on each side and 2 bolts per. So you have 4 total bolts holding the center section into the turbine housing. What you're going to want to do is go in here with a 13mm wrench. It's fairly simple. You're going to go in here and just break them free. Loosen them up. And then as you loosen all 4 of these up, you'll notice you'll actually be able to go in and spin the housing, because some of these may be difficult to get to. So what you're going to want to do is basically go in there and loosen all these up. We're going to show installing it that way. The other way to install the turbo is you can essentially take it and put it in as one unit. What we're going to actually do is take the exhaust housing off and install it with the exhaust housing off of the turbo. That allows you to get to these 4 flange bolts that bolt to the manifold easier. It makes it a little easier to get to, a little easier to tighten them, and it keeps everything a little more open. You will need to also clock the turbo, meaning once we get everything kind of in there, you're going to actually want to leave the compressor housing and turbine housing bolts loose until you get everything kind of clocked the way you need it. We'll go over that here in a second. Once you get the turbine housing removed from the turbo, this is essentially what you'll have. You're going to take your housing in your T4 gasket that came with in the turbo box. You're going to line all this up. The large flange will obviously face towards the back of the truck or towards the cab. You're going to line this up. You're going to take your 4 20mm long bolts with a 15mm drive, and you're going to put your small washer also on the bolt. And then put all 4 of your bolts in, tighten them up the best you can. These are very hard to get a good torque setting on, so just make them pretty much as tight as you can get them by hand with a wrench. And then once you get your bolts installed, we'll move on to getting the turbo in, positioned, clocked, and get the drain kind of set up. The next thing we're going to do is install the turbo oil drain flange. You're going to need 2 bolts, the drain flange itself, and also the O-ring for it. So here's the drain flange. You're going to want to grab that. Your 2 shorter Allen bolts. These are also an 8mm drive. And the thinner, larger diameter O-ring. Kind of see that. That will fit right in there. You can install your O-ring, and then this is ready to go on the turbo. You're literally just going to sit it on there, bolt it up. The next thing you're going to want to do is grab your drain hose and cut 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch off of each end of it. And it'll look something similar to that. Now that you've done that, you're going to take this, install it loosely on the turbo drain, and install the 2 O-rings that you have left over on it. Once you do that, you're going to shove it in one end of the tube, and you can actually go ahead, and once you get this on, you can actually go ahead and put one of the clamps on it. You do have 2 clamps for this tube. So basically what you're going to do is install this, get it on there good. You're going to want to leave the clamp probably loose for now, because essentially what you're going to do is lube this up, stick it on the bottom of the turbo. You're going to dry fit the turbo so that you can get this oriented, as it does clock around. So what you got to do is kind of get this at the right angle, and then once you do that and everything looks good, you're going to have to kind of go in there and look and make sure that you're happy, and you don't want the tube kind of pushed down and kinked. You want this to be basically look the way it does. You just have to figure out which way to orientate it. Once you get that done, you're going to pull the center section back out. You're going to put all your clamps and everything on it, make it nice and tight, and then basically you're going to put the center section of the turbo back down in there and leave it. And we will show you how to do that here now. So essentially you're going to want it to look like this. You're going to put your flange on, bolt it down. You're going to cut your tube to length, put your fitting in it, and you want to be able to move it like this, so that whenever we take this center section and set it into the turbine housing, you can essentially line this up and get it where you need it to go. And I recommend actually dry fitting it, putting it into the pedestal, making sure everything lines up properly before actually pulling it back out to put the clamps on. Also, make sure you lube these O-rings. They are very tight fitting, and it will help you for the installation and removal process. We're going to show you the best that we can here how to get this kind of oriented and set in there. So what you're going to want to do is kind of get it lined up with the hole. You're going to want to flex the hose and get the turbine to set in there, kind of like so. You'll kind of feel everything just kind of set in. So as you can see, the hose will kind of, if you keep everything lubed up well, the hose will kind of find its way in there. So now that the turbo's kind of set in there, you can see that there's nothing really on much of a bind. So what you're going to want to do is keep that turned essentially like that. That's pretty much what you need. I don't know if that shows it too well. The other thing is too, that you'll notice on the top of the turbo, is you want to clock the drain so that the oil feed is level. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to turn this kind of like so until until you can get the center section of the turbo to actually be level. So as you can see right there, that's pretty flat, it's pretty level. It's not like you have to use a level, physically to, get it right, but you kind of want it to be flat with the eye. So now that you have it clocked, as I said, get it as level as you can. But now that you have it clocked and you know where this tube needs to kind of go, all you're going to do is reverse what you just did. You're going to pull the turbine out and kind of down. The hose is flexible enough it won't hurt the hose. And then as long as that's lubed up good, this will just lift right up out of there. It'll pop out like that. Now you can go back to the bench, actually put your clamps on the oil return hose, and then put it back in. Alright, once you get your clamps and everything installed back on the return hose, I didn't do that because it's not really necessary in this application, but obviously you're going to want to put your clamps on here. Once you do that, you can go ahead, put your turbo back in. Same thing we just showed you. You're going to basically go like that, get it to drop down in there. And lube on the O-rings and on that fitting are going to be very key to making your life easy. So once you do that, you're essentially going to take your turbo actually will stay in there, but you're going to take and grab your C washers, these clamps that hold it in to the turbine housing, and your 4 bolts, and you're going to put these in, and you're going to be able to actually tighten the exhaust side down. So once you get these in there and they're good to go, snug them up. Once again, it's kind of hard to put an actual torque number on these, but you're going to put these in here, tighten everything down, get them nice and snug. You'll be able to get on them with a wrench. So after you get those bolts in, you're going to obviously tighten them up. On the exhaust, on the exhaust housing, bolting that on first and kind of doing it the way I just showed you, that is only one way to do it. The other way you can do it is you can leave these 4 bolts out, use the turbo as an assembly, basically do what we just did with the housing, but you have to deal with the whole turbo as an assembly to get it clocked, to get the drain clocked. And it's a little bit more difficult that way. But there's obviously more than one way that you can go about doing this. So I like doing it that way because it's easier to get to the mounting bolts, but it's not 100% necessary. So once you get to that point and you get the exhaust housing tight on the manifold, you get all this stuff, your oil returns all set right, and you put your C washers back in to hold the center section to the turbine and tighten them down, you're basically ready to clock the compressor housing now, which this should be loose. You will notice that the SPE is actually going to be clocked down a little. Not much, just a little bit, but you'll feel that hit and then just back it off a smidge. And that's basically going to be where you need to be at on the compressor housing, and you can go and tighten all the rear bolts now. Also, after installing your turbine housing or the turbo, whichever way you end up going, you're going to grab your exhaust outlet adapter and your 15 style downpipe, the top piece, and you're going to install this with a 15 clamp, and then you're going to use your S300 clamp that we provide in the kit, and you're going to mount that on the turbo. Once you get this on here, you're going to notice that you can kind of feel it, line it up a little bit, put your clamp on, tighten it down, snug it up, and then you're going to take this and sit it right against the actual engine cover. This bolt will not be used. You will actually use the head bolt. There's a bolt on the side of the head here, so if you are using the MBRP downpipe or aftermarket downpipe, you're going to have 2 pieces. You'll bolt this up first, hit both of your clamps, leave this touching the rear cover. You'll put your lower section in, bring it up, leave this top clamp loose, and then you'll actually use the bolted section for the cylinder head, where you'll actually put a bolt in there. Other than that, that's pretty much it. Then your downpipe is finished. Once you get it bolted to the head and down underneath, come up here and tighten your upper clamp, and the downpipe's finished. The other thing that you can do, on a side note, is you can also dry fit if you're doing the complete turbo, or vice versa. You can do this either way. You can also clock this the way I just described, drain tube, and then backing it off a little. What you can actually do is do all that when this is all dry fit, take this whole thing back out, tighten these up on the bench at that point if you don't want to do it in the truck, and then sit everything back down in there. You can do it in any order that you would want to. You can bolt the turbine housing on, then do that, put it back in, or you can take the whole turbo on and off. It doesn't really matter. Whatever you're more comfortable with doing. It is a little bit harder to get a wrench, you know, back here when the turbo is, you know, on the engine already, obviously. But it definitely can be done. You can get to them to do it that way. So that's just an option. You can kind of do it however you're comfortable. All right, now we're going to put the oil feed line to the turbo. The pedestal, we already threaded. The first feed fitting is already in the pedestal. We put that in there prior to putting the pedestal on. You're going to take and thread the oil line. You're going to put the straight end on that fitting. Leave it loose for now. And then you're going to take the only other fitting that you have, or I should say the only other dash 4 fitting that you have. It's dash 4 1/4 NPT. You're going to take that. This is actually larger thread than the pedestal. You're going to put tape or a thread sealer on it. I recommend one or the other. I'm going to put that in, tighten it down with a 9/16 or 14 millimeter. And then what you're going to do is thread your oil line onto that, onto the top. And then once you do that, the only thing I recommend doing before tightening the line up entirely is I do recommend keeping it, favoring the line towards the compressor housing rather than the turbine housing, because you don't want it to obviously get it hot or possibly melt the liner inside of it. So I recommend keeping it, you don't have to keep it against the compressor housing, but keep it more towards the side of the, you know, the compressor housing side of the turbo. And then once you get it kind of situated where you want it, get in there, tighten them up. I believe they're 14 millimeter. Tighten them down, and then your oil system is complete on the turbo. Now we're going to take and cap off the coolant line that used to feed the factory turbo, because obviously this turbo doesn't take coolant, so we're going to need to cap that. As I said earlier in the video, you're either going to have a silicone cap or a push-in plug. So basically, just going to stick that on there like that using the supplied clamp, tighten it down, and that's finished. Once you get that on, you can install an EGT sensor into the manifold. This will take a DPF sensor or the EGR temperature sensor, either or. But if you do run the DPF sensor in there, you can read EGT depending on what kind of tuning device you're using. So that works great for that. So put your sensor in there, and then you're good to go. And now we're going to move on to setting up the lower intake adapter. This portion of the lower intake setup will be different depending on how you're utilizing this kit. If you're utilizing this kit as just purely a drop-in turbo, then you are going to need your adapter coupler. This will also need to be clocked, and it will be clocked based upon, you know, getting your lower intake set in here. You will need a 15 and up style lower intake manifold. I'll show you that right now. 11 to 14 wide frame truck is gonna have you know, the single sequential turbo with 2 inlets on it. So you want the 11 to 15 style with single inlet. This is gonna go on here like so. And then you're going to need to swivel this depending on where it needs to go to get the mounting bolts. You'll have 3 mounting bolts for the lower intake. So what we're going to do is work this. We're going to twist this until we can get these bolt holes to line up. So it will look something similar to that. The SPE logo, once again, will be clocked kind of at the 1 o'clock position, roughly, and then you'll be able to get all 3 of your bolts in. This will bolt down nice and flat, and then you're finished with that. Now you're going to be able to install your upper intake manifold. And in this scenario, we're doing a drop-in style, so this will just bolt right up. We'll set this in the truck. Put all your factory bolts in. We're going to leave this off in this case just so we can keep it open so you can see what's going on. On the 11 to 14 trucks, you're going to have a fuel rail running to the fuel line running to the CP4 that runs through here. And there's going to be a temp sensor with a green plastic top on it. You're going to need to remove that and then install. You're going to install this little fitting here. That is a metric thread, and that is going. And you're going to reuse the copper washer off the bottom of the sensor. So you want to take the sensor off, take the copper washer, slide it on here, bolt this in its place. The next step will be your charge pipe. You're going to take the factory hot side pipe, and there's a metal band that wraps around this boot. You cut that band off. You're not going to use the band or the coupler or anything. So if you do slice it like that, it's not going to matter. It's fine. You can just throw it all away. And then you're going to use the supplied hump hose in the kit with its T-bolt clamps. You're going to slide that on there like that, tighten down with the T-bolt, and then you're going to use the factory coupler on this end with the snap ring. You can install your snap ring, push it on the turbo, snap it on, and then this end will push onto the intercooler, tighten your T-bolt clamps. Alright guys, well I hope that answered most of the questions that you would have on the installation of it, but that pretty much covers it. There are certain things that are different from the 11 to 14 to the 15 to 19 trucks. Basically, that fuel temperature sensor doesn't need to be messed with on the it would be the 15 to 19 trucks. And then obviously, if you're doing an intercooler piping kit or anything like that, you're not going to use the lower intake or the adapter coupler. So other than that, all the kits are pretty similar. The only difference is, like I said, is on the 15 and up, you will not need to purchase any additional parts to the basic drop-in kit because you'll already have the correct up pipe, down pipe, lower intake, everything that you would need. But other than that, feel free to message us on Facebook with any questions, email us, or call the shop. We'd be happy to help you in any way that we can. And then, along the way, if there's any updates or changes to this, we will make videos accordingly. Keep an eye out for more product videos and more installation stuff. We want to thank you for purchasing the kit if you already purchased it. If you're thinking about purchasing it, you do have questions, like I said, make sure that you hit us up and we can get those answered for you. If there's anything else that you would need from us, let us know.